This is the story of Wijaya Air Flight 182. The 9th of January was a day like any other. At Indonesia's Sokarno Hatta International Airport, a Boeing 737-500 was getting ready to make a quick hop from Indonesia's Sokarno Hatta International Airport to Supaido International Airport, also in Indonesia. At 1:36 p.m. local time, the passenger jet with 62 people on board lifted off from runway 25 right at Sokarno Hatta International Airport. The captain was the one at the controls and the first officer was the one monitoring the progress of the flight. The first officer got on the radio with the Terminal East controller. The Terminal East controller had a transmission for the crew. SJY-182 identified on departure via standard instrument departure, unrestricted climb level 290. The crew acknowledged and put the plane into a climb to follow out the orders that they had been given. As the plane passed through 1,700 feet, the autopilot was engaged, and as the plane passed through 5,400 feet, the horizontal navigation of the plane was set to the heading select from the LNAV mode. All of this was standard and nothing out of the ordinary. The pilots were on radar at this point, and the plane was going exactly the way that they wanted it to. As the plane closed in on 8,000 feet of altitude, slight cracks started to appear in the armour. A small thrust asymmetry was starting to develop on the plane. This was strange. The plane had been cleared up to 29,000 feet, and there was absolutely no reason why a thrust asymmetry would develop on the plane right now. So the left-hand engine ever so slightly started to fall from producing 92.8% of power that it should. The pilots did not notice this happening. The pilots were busy with the weather that they'd be flying through, and the pilots noticed that there was a weather system on their way, and they were asking ATC if they could turn to the right to 075 degrees so that they could avoid a storm system that was right in front of them. As Flight 182 climbed, ATC wanted Flight 182 to hold at 11,000 feet for a bit. This was to prevent a conflict with another plane that was departing from runway 25 left at Sokarno Hatta International Airport. But as all of this was happening, the left-hand engine was slowly losing power. It was now at 86.4%. This kept happening when the plane was at 10,100 feet. The pilots were focused on getting the plane leveled off at 11,000 feet. But the left-hand engine was still bleeding performance compared to the right-hand one. It was now at 72.7% power. When the power had decreased to 67.5%, the plane went into a right-hand roll to capture the heading that the pilots had selected. So far, the autopilot was countering the effects of the left-hand engine pretty well, and the pilots were unaware that anything was wrong with their plane. But by the time the left-hand engine was at 59%, the plane started rolling to the left, just a little bit. The pilots were still busy with leveling the plane off at 11,000 feet, and they failed to notice that the plane was banking to the left at 7 degrees. Now, just when they had leveled the plane off at 11,000 feet, ATC now wanted the plane to climb and maintain 13,000 feet. As the pilots were about to do that, they got the first sign of trouble. The EGPWS system on the plane let out a warning that said bank angle, letting the pilots know that the plane was banking too much to the left. Just how much, you ask? Well, that 7-degree bank that I mentioned before had now grown into a 37-degree left-hand bank. The pilots at this point needed to do everything possible to keep things from getting worse. The left-hand engine at this point had dropped to 35% power, and it was still fading. Then the plane started to descend. The pilots activated the stabilizer trim system, which deactivated the autopilot. But the pilots just could not recover the plane from what it was doing. The nose of the plane dropped and the plane started losing altitude. The pilots did not have a lot of time to act, and time was running out. On land, the ATC controller tried to hail Flight 182 for a heading update, but they got no reply. They tried again, but again, no reply. Then the tiny blip that represented Flight 182 just vanished off of the radar screen at Sokarno Hatta International Airport. A passenger jet with 62 people on board had just gone missing. It wasn't long before people put two and two together. The jet had gone down off the coast of Jakarta. The sea at the point of impact was about 16 meters or 52 feet deep. This meant that getting to the wreck of the plane, while difficult, would not be impossible. The team recovered as much of the plane as possible and sent the wreck to the Jakarta International Container Terminal to be studied. As the wreck came up, the investigators were looking for telltale signs of a fire that could have brought the plane down. But the wreck of the plane showed no signs of a fire anywhere. But while the wreck of Flight 182 was being dredged up, the investigators started looking into the plane itself to see if there was anything there that could explain the crash. The flight data recorder of Flight 182 gave them their first clue that something was wrong on the flight. Well, they saw that during the climb out, the autopilot and the auto throttle were both engaged. But as the plane was leveling out, they saw that engine number 1, the left-hand side engine, started to lose power. But here's the thing. It wasn't because the engine was faulty in any way, but the auto throttle was commanding that from the engine, as it should because the plane is leveling out. But for some reason, the auto throttle was unable to command that same reduction in power from the right-hand engine. This meant that slowly but surely a thrust asymmetry was beginning to take hold of the plane. The left-hand engine was at a relatively low power setting, and the right-hand engine was at a high setting. So, the investigators went digging, and to their shock, they found out that this issue was not new, and it had been on the plane since 2013. Since 2013, there had been 65 separate issues written up about the auto throttle system on this plane. The first complaint from 2013 said that the auto throttle switch was not able to keep the auto throttle in the armed setting. Digging deeper, they found out that in addition to the 65 error messages made by the pilots, the AML, or the aircraft maintenance log, had logged an additional 69 errors about the auto throttle system. When problems like these popped up, the engineers usually just cleaned out the connectors of the auto throttle system, and usually that cleared up the problem. But for some reason it kept coming back. Buried among those pilot reports were reports of the auto throttle pulling back power on the left-hand engine, but not the right-hand engine. That is exactly what happened on this flight. But why was this happening? They tested the auto throttle servo and the computer itself to see if those parts were causing the problem. But those parts passed with flying colors. Something else was causing this thrust asymmetry. This led them to consider friction as a potential failure point. The auto throttle was able to move the left-hand throttle with no issue, but something was preventing it from manipulating the right-hand throttle in the same way, leading to the thrust asymmetry on the accident airplane. Something was clogging up the movement of the right-hand throttle. Here's a quote from the report. The investigation assumed that the auto throttle system command was unable to move the right thrust lever as a result of friction or binding within the mechanical system, except the torque switch mechanism. End quote. Now we get to the next link in the chain that brought down Flight 182, the CSTM, or the Cruise Thrust Split Monitor. The CSTM is basically there to make sure that the plane does not get into a situation where the thrust asymmetry can put the plane in serious danger. It basically asks the question, hey, is this thrust situation dangerous? If it does find that the thrust asymmetry is getting to a point where the plane might be in danger, then the CSTM will disable the auto throttle, thus preventing the situation from getting worse. One of the parameters that the CSTM looks at is the spoiler deflection, but the flight data recorder did not record that. So Boeing had to calculate the probable spoiler deflection, and they came to the value of 3.7 degrees. By design, the CSTM should have disabled the auto throttle at this point. But here's the thing though, the CSTM only kicked in after the asymmetric thrust had put the plane into a left-hand roll. In fact, this had happened on a previous flight. In that instance, the CSTM was unable to prevent an uncommanded roll due to thrust asymmetry. So now the question becomes, why didn't the CSTM activate when it should have? The CSTM uses data from a lot of sources to figure out what the thrust situation is like on the plane. It uses things like the throttle angles, the N1 values from both engines, the aileron and spoiler positions, etc. The investigators went through each input to see if a failure in that input could cause the CSTM to mess up, and they came to the spoiler sensors. They found out that if the spoiler sensors were miscalibrated or rigged incorrectly, then it could have an effect on the CSTM and when it kicked in. And in this case, they think that the sensors were damaged in some way, causing the CSTM to kick in only after a dangerous situation had developed. Now, all of this still doesn't explain the accident. This plane had 2 qualified pilots that were in the cockpit, and they should have been able to see that things were going south, and then they should have intervened and saved the plane. The first sign that the pilots would have seen of something being wrong would have been on the panels of the 737 showing thrust asymmetry. While the captain was flying, the first officer should have been keeping an eye on the instruments and making sure that the plane was doing what it was supposed to. They had enough time to see that something was going on, and then they should have rectified the issue. This is especially true when the autopilot was struggling to put the plane into the right-hand turn that the pilots had commanded. This is especially confusing when you consider the fact that on the 15th of March 2020, the pilot flying got into a very similar situation and was able to recover the plane in that instance. He probably thought that the automation would come through for him this time as well. He trusted his plane to do what he told it to, but in this case it did not. But as this is happening, all is not lost. There is still time to recover. But as we established before, the pilots were not actively monitoring the plane. They expected the automation to do its job. Then, when the autopilot was disconnected, the force that had been keeping the plane somewhat in check was lost, and the yaw to the left got so much more worse. These pilots had been caught off guard, and now they were thrown into a situation where they suddenly had to face a plane that was doing something that they did not expect it to. And that final startle factor sealed the fate of Flight 182. From then on, the pilots tried to save the plane, but they were passengers just along for the ride, just like everyone else. In the end, a bunch of small errors came together to make this happen. The pilots could not react in time to save the plane, and unfortunately, that caused the crash. If you have any thoughts, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.